French composer Claude Debussy published his first set of 12 preludes in the year 1910. And he published a second set a couple years later, also of 12. And altogether, these 24 preludes rate among the most important collections of keyboard music ever published in Europe. They're up there with the Chopin 24 Etudes, or the 32 Beethoven piano sonatas, or Bach's Well-Tempered Claviers, Book 1 and Book 2. They're just amazing, important pieces, and they really expand the expressive potential of the instrument. So this particular prelude is the fourth one from Book 1, and its title is an absolute mouthful. It is Les sons et les parfums tournent dans l'air du soir, which means the sounds and perfumes turn in the evening air. So in a sense, this piece is a nocturne. It's just not called one, or a nighttime piece, because it is about evening time. And the very long title is actually a quote from a poem by the great French symbolist poet Charles Baudelaire. Now, Baudelaire is from a generation earlier than Debussy. He published his seminal collection of French poetry, Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil, in 1857, and immediately caught the attention of the French government, who ruled that many of the poems were simply too obscene to actually be published. Baudelaire was a poetic genius. He's arguably the most important French poet, really, in the entire history of the country, and in the almost 200 years now since the publication of Les Fleurs du Mal, he remains incredibly influential. Scholars are still spending a lot of time talking about his work. He was a troubled individual. This does need to be mentioned. Baudelaire was he was a decadent in the truest sense of the word. He became addicted to hashish and opium while as a law student. He remained an opium addict his entire life until he died tragically young at the age of 46 in a nursing home because the drugs had done so much damage to him. He was also very much into prostitutes and the nightlife of Paris. He was a profligate spender. He went through his inheritance incredibly quickly. So he was a really troubled individual, but he was a wizard when it came to composing verse in French. So Debussy was a huge fan of Baudelaire, and almost every French artist of Debussy's generation was also a huge fan of Baudelaire. So Debussy set several of Baudelaire's poems to music as compositions for piano and voice. But this piece is just for solo piano, and the poem that the title comes from is called Harmonie du Soir, which means evening harmonies. And Baudelaire is what we consider like the first of this capital S symbolists in French culture. So symbolism, like Impressionism or Art Nouveau, is a really important aesthetic movement from this era. And it's a little bit difficult to pin down, but the symbolists were definitely interested in a few things, one of which was the inherent musicality of language, specifically the French language. So it's been a minute since I've been to France, but I'm going to give this a rip here just to give you the sense of kind of how the poem sounds en français and how musical it sounds. Voici venir les temps où vibrant sur sa tige, chaque fleur s'évapore ainsi qu'en un encens soir. Les sons et les parfums tournent dans l'air du soir, valse mélancolique et languoreux vertige. Okay, so it sounds like if you're an English speaker, like I'm a native English speaker, it's a lot sexier than a lot of our poetry generally tends to sound. And the way that the words kind of melt into each other, creating this musicality, is very, very beautiful. And this is something that would have attracted Debussy to Baudelaire. But Debussy was also interested in the content of this poem. And the poem is essentially about all the magical things that happen as the sun is going down and night is becoming ascendant. And there's lots of images in this poem that Baudelaire, relatively short poem that Baudelaire brings out, one of which is this notion of a waltz, okay? He specifically calls it a melancholy waltz combined with languorous vertigo. And so the way Debussy achieves this is the piece is sort of a waltz, but it's a very distorted waltz. Instead of being in 3/4, which all waltzes are, Debussy frequently inserts measures of 5/4 into the piece, which kind of makes it sound like uneven and kind of like we have a sense of vertigo. So both of those measures I just played have 5 beats. Now we go to straight 3/4. And one of the things Baudelaire talks about in his poem is this notion of these flowers evaporating, okay, into thin air as nighttime approaches. And this sense of evaporation, we get these ascending little minor thirds, okay? Another image that Baudelaire uses in the poem is that of violins, kind of sobbing violins. But the most powerful image in the poem is this notion of the sun drowning in its congealed blood. That's an actual line from the poem. And so Debussy was a nature worshiper. Nature was really the most important influence on his entire aesthetic, and he really tried to model his music on the creative processes of nature. And the sun was especially important to him. So in compositions where the sun is prominent, Debussy really goes the extra mile to highlight what an awesome force it is. This is very evident in the first movement of his symphonic masterpiece, La Mer, which the first movement is titled De l'aube à midi sur la mer, which means from dawn to noon on the sea. And as the sun becomes ascendant in that piece at high noon, there's this like glorious orchestral explosion that concludes that opening movement. Well, here it's a little bit different because the sun's being drowned out by its own congealed blood. And this leads Debussy to write one of his creepiest, most spaced out sections really in his entire oeuvre, which is saying something. And it sounds, when we get to that part in the piece, it sounds like this. And it's this, in context of the whole piece, it's this really magical effect. Debussy was very interested in lots of different artists, and several of the other preludes make allusions, either literary or visual, but Debussy specifically writes that this line comes from Charles Baudelaire, just to say, I'm a huge fan of this guy, his poetry is amazing, and this would have been, he would have found a ready audience in early 20th century Paris. Baudelaire had long been dead, almost for longer than 40 years, really 50 years. But his poetry was as influential as ever and remains so today.